Hello and welcome to another episode of the Melbourne Athletic Development Podcast. This episode of Lateral Think is brought to you with the support of Strength by Numbers. Strength by Numbers have created an integrated clinical and sports performance system. The AXA system uses force platforms, dynamometry and strain gauges to objectively measure everything from isolated movements to sports performance tasks. The system has greatly enhanced our clinical practice, decision making and objectivity. We are no longer guessing. The greatest thing is its ease of use both for practitioners and clients. There are no wires, no fixed setup. It is a fully integrated Bluetooth system. If this sounds like something that would enhance your practice, visit strengthbynumbers.com and tell them that Melbourne Athletic Development sent you.
So today we have Tom Templeton joining us, Tom's a strength and conditioning coach who's done work with us before and is going to be joining the MAD team again next year to do more work, and he's got quite an extensive experience in high performance, but is also a high level sprinter himself. So I think it'd be good to have you on today, Tom, to have a chat with us, and I think it'd be interesting to hear you and John bouncing questions and ideas of each other to talk about sprinting in a bit more detail.
Absolutely, yeah. Thanks for having me, Jack. When Johnny said I was coming on, I was pretty excited, so I'm looking forward to talking some shop here today.
Yeah, good. So let's go straight into it. Is sprinting ability changeable?
For sure. For sure.
Next question then.
Yeah, next question, moving on. Answered. No, like you always hear that saying, like, you know, someone, you can make them faster, but they're not necessarily going to be fast. And that rings so true.
I always think back to, like, I don't know if you've seen that cool little documentary series that was on Eurosport, and it was like John Smith and his squad, the HSI squad.
Yeah.
And he says, you know, like, you can't get a donkey to win the Kentucky Derby. And I always laugh at that because the reality is, like, you can make people faster. There's always opportunity to change the factors that influence sprinting, but you're not going to turn someone who is relatively slow into the world record holder. It's just not going to happen. They need to have a certain level of innate ability.
Yeah. Genetics do play a massive role.
Well, I think that like that's where, you know, we go down this path. Like, how much of it is being influenced by genetics and how much of it's being influenced by, you know, environmental and epigenetic factors. Because I think it's a really interesting interplay, and this discussion kind of got really deep, I think, when particularly the Jamaicans started doing really well through the period of, like, Usain Bolt, Johan Blake, and prior to that, obviously, Asafa Powell, and then the women came along as well. You had Shelly-Ann Fraser and those three girls that, you know, won the Olympic sort of treble.
Like Elaine and...
No, prior to that, it was like in 2008 when you had, can't remember what her name, I gone blank on the two that finished second and third. And then what happened was, obviously, Elaine Thompson came along, and now we've had, like, Sharika Jackson as well, showing, like, insane range. Yeah. But obviously, Shelley's been there the whole time. And it's interesting because there was a huge discussion, because I think Jamaica only has about 4 million people.
Yeah.
So it's like, how does a population that small produce that many high-level sprinters? And obviously, one of the things that gets brought up straight away is drugs.
Yeah.
But we'll leave that aside because I think that there's more to it than that.
Yeah.
I think the first and key component is definitely there is a genetic component, but there's also a very strong sociocultural one.
Oh, for sure. I mean, you even look at, I start trying to backtrack, you know, and you look at, like, Glenn Mills and Stephen Francis.
You look at their histories.
Yeah, you look at their histories and what they've done, and then you go and look at, like, Asaf obviously blew up and, like, broke the world record in, like, 2007, I think.
Yep.
But then you look at Asaf, and Asaf has got, like, I think he's got, like, 5 or 6 brothers or something like that. And then you see, his brother Donovan Powell was, like, in the 1999, like, World Indoors, running, like, 6:52, and, like, ran exactly like him, you know what I mean? And then you got, like, Merliotti.
Yeah, the history there.
And there's a lot of stuff.
Making, like, 8-9 Olympics was ridiculous.
For sure. And I think that just builds.
Well, it even goes further back than that, you know, like...
Like Don Quarry as well?
Don Quarry, and even before Don Quarry, you know, like Herb McKinley and all of those kind of guys, you know, 400-metre runners that were always at the world level. Jamaica's obviously had a very strong history of it, and I think that kind of lays the foundation for why they have such a strong drive to be successful in it. And as I said, the sociocultural factors are interesting ones. We're probably going on a weird side tangent now anyway, but...
It was going to happen.
I think... For those listening, this whole discussion is going to be tangents, but
I'll try and mediate to bring you back on track.
The big thing that I think is really key with this is, like, in Jamaica, there's 3 sports, right? There's cricket, there's soccer, football, and there's athletics. They're the 3 things that country does. Obviously, there's little things like the bobsled team, sort of blew up after, and then there's the cool running sort of explaining that story. But essentially they've got 3 sports, and that is a big factor. Then if you look at obviously their proud history of participation in athletics, it's driven and built things like their schools champs. Yep. So for anyone who follows that, like their school championships are very heavily and widely attended, so much so that like someone told me you go there and there's 40,000 plus people in the National Stadium in Kingston to watch a school-aged event, and people are standing at the front trying to get tickets to get in, even though it's live on TV.
Yeah, it's crazy.
And it's sold out. So it's like there is a significant interest and drive in the sport.
But part of that is obviously too, I'm assuming you're seeing some very good results at that school age level as well.
Yeah, and that has its benefits and its downsides as well, because you've got people who are pushing kids. Like one of the things I notice a lot about those champs, you see a lot of injuries actually happen in those championships.
Oh, right.
A lot of people like straining hamstrings and things like that. And there's a lot of athletes that you see come through that system that you don't ever see again, even though they've produced insane results. Mm-hmm. And I think that'll get us into some discussion about specialization and when to start some of that, and we'll come back to that. But I think there is a significant drive to have performance and success in that country.
So at that moment as well. I think like if you're trying to condense like an athlete's career into like a school's champs, and like we've got to do everything we can to get the best performance right now. Like what are you leaving on the table? You know what I mean? Like I like that analogy. Really rung home to me. It's like you can't put the toothpaste back in the tube. Once you squeeze it out, like it's gone.
Well, going back to the question then about changing sprintability, even staying on this example of looking at, say, Jamaican runners, do they get a lot of development in their sprint mechanics, or is it just this is just innate ability that they actually have? Or you're not really sure about that?
It'd be like obviously it's very outside of looking in. You're just looking at like training videos and performances, but
it's hard to tell.
You've got to assume that they're going to be doing stuff like to work on mechanics. Like I mean, the 2 coaches I have named are highly successful, multiple Olympic champions, world record holders. Like I don't think you just run and get the job done. Like there's obviously elements. Just depends on how much emphasis you put on it.
I'll put this caveat in. There are a number of the programs that I've seen with Jamaica that are very much volume based. So it's just like they just pump the work into these kids, right? And that in itself causes issues because I said you have these injury chains. And don't get me wrong, they are doing some things really well at a higher level, as Tom's saying, and we can talk about the training of elite sprinters when we get to it. But one of the things that's really clear is you've got kids there that are 15 running 10-1, 10-2. You have females running low 11s at 15, 16 years of age, which is as fast as our athletes run as adults. So the genetic component is extremely strong. And if you look at the actual data on this, like if you look at an analysis of most of the sprinting that's happened in the last 20 years, the vast majority of high-level performers, medalists, finalists are from West African descent. Yeah. Interestingly, we've seen some change with that recently. And I think that's actually come about probably from 2 factors. One is knowledge is increasing and the type of training is changing. And the other factor is I think technology is assisting this quite a bit, both with tracks, shoes, facilities, and even something that technology in terms of measuring things, but also one of the key ones is overspeed equipment, things like 1080 sprint has probably changed. It's interesting because I don't even know that you need to use it. I don't think that's the factor. I think it's just that it's elucidating information that previously wasn't there about how to kind of push things along.
Yep.
Is that also related to, because it seems to me that one of the things that stands out with sprinting is being able to maintain your training ability, i.e. not get injured and train over long periods of time. So do you think that's where technology helps with being able to
assess those things? Yeah, training? So there's so many factors in it. So like if we go back to your original question, is sprinting changeable? Yes. All right. The key and most important factor, I think, which is always going to be the case, and we've spoken about this so many times when we talk about like the exercise selection and classification of exercise, the most important thing to do to change sprinting is to run fast and run fast relatively often.
Yeah,
right?
well, relatively is the key word there, because you see a lot of people, obviously I've seen a lot of stuff on Instagram where it's just like, yep, sprint fast, sprint often. And it's like, it needs to be relative, and the big reason for that is that you will cook yourself. Like if your CNS is not ready to sprint, you can't just sprint every single day.
Well, you've got to be careful with that, because people use terms like CNS and they don't have a clue what they're talking about.
Of course, yeah.
Right? And even like it gets thrown around in the world, and for those listening, CNS refers to central nervous system, right? And what these people are referring to is your ability to have outflow from your motor, cortex, sensory information coming in, and also your ability to manage coordinative type of capabilities.
Yeah.
What you find is if you do lots of very high intensity training, whether that be lifting, sprinting, jumping,
Maximal intensity.
yeah, you seem to lose some of those coordinative capabilities, both for your motor outflow and also the sensory input, right? But I don't think we understand it very well. So people use that term very broadly and say your central nervous system is a mess, right? And I don't think they know what they're talking about. And the other key factor that, and I'm going on a rant here, so buckle up. The thing that drives me nuts is that there's this idea in sprint culture and sprint coaching that your central nervous system is not trainable to intensity, to repeated bouts of high intensity training stress or competition stress.
Yeah.
Which is actually a load of bullshit, right? Because you see this across seasons even, and the key place you tend to see it is people performing across rounds.
Yeah.
So you find early on in the season, if you haven't run lots of rounds, so like a heat, semi and a final, typically you might get to, if you get to say the final, you underperform because you essentially your central nervous system is saying like, I actually can't produce that same level of motor drive.
Yeah, like the battery's getting drained.
Yeah. But you do it a few times through the season and you can, which tells you that you've
It's adaptable, like changeable.
Exactly. So sorry for going on that rant, but I think it's important, like you say CNS, I think one of the things that's really key is it's not that it's not true. It is. It's highly true what you're saying. However, the key issue to deal with is what is the ability for that person to do high intensity training, what volume of it and at what intensity for that time, for that person.
Yeah.
It's the individualization that's key.
Absolutely.
So for someone who's highly undertrained, right? Well, actually, we've got to put another caveat on that. If they're undertrained and haven't done a lot of sprinting before, they probably actually can't produce enough intensity to even hurt themselves too much from a central nervous system
Well, we
point of
found
view.
that in some of the schoolwork.
Yeah.
We did it,
Yeah, Tom and I did some work with at one of the high schools this year, and interestingly, like we found that applying some of the methodology that we found successful with more experienced sprinters on a group of kids that basically hadn't done anything for a couple of years
It was
with
a broad
COVID.
range of times from, this is just straight off the bat, 15 to 12 seconds. So the type of sprinters we're talking about here, over the 100 metre mark. They just didn't respond, and it was something that I did want to bring up is understanding intensity. I don't think a lot of people really understand what is their max effort. And kids will run through and be, I was going flat out, and you're like, okay, well, you need to have some type of feedback there to then measure and be like, okay, well, let's try and do this. And then you start seeing, okay, if they learn the intensity they need to run at, they might start getting to where the point where their central nervous system is fatiguing or...
Well, I was going to ask them just to think about putting this in the context, because I think one thing that's clear is, yes, we can change sprintability, but I think the next question is then how?
Yeah.
And I think too, just thinking about, even for the population groups we work with, but even for listeners, because they're working in rehab or performance settings outside of elite sprinters, what are the kind of things that you think you need to start with?
Well,
I realise there's different...
I think we've spoken about this a lot in terms of the framework that we kind of view most performance or injuries through. And that lens is in three parts, right? And in changing running, they make sense as well. So the big one that I think we can get onto now, but I'll mention the other two, is biomechanics.
Yep.
Right? And that's both, you need to do tasks that are biomechanically appropriate, i.e. the intensity is high enough. Obviously, it's the mechanics of, the kinematic factors of what positions you're in, the kinetic features of how like how you're actually applying those forces and in what way.
Yep.
And then, the third factor is the spatiotemporal features, which is, understanding things like stride length, stride frequency, contact times, which we can get into the biomechanics of that in a moment. The second one is obviously tissue capacities, right, which we talk about obviously in injuries, and it's the first thing that a lot of health practitioners or even strength and conditioning professionals will look at. Like, okay, let's look at their strength, let's look at this part of the body, let's look at this compound movement, let's look at this power output for a clean or a squat or whatever it is, a jump task, the elastic features. You need to have those as well. And we'll talk about what maybe developmental and or elite sprinters are doing in male and female categories for those kind of things. And then the third one is obviously we talk about hormetic load, but for this is probably thinking about things like training load. And it's like, how often can you expose this person to that intensity we spoke about?
Yeah.
That is individual, but as a general rule, you're probably looking at sprinting reasonably fast over any distance between, 30 and up to 100 plus meters.
Yep.
2 to 3 times a week is reasonable for a beginner. And over time, you actually find that sometimes that actually needs to get less, right? Because the amount of stress that person creates can actually be too damaging. So they might go down to as little as once per week. And some people even less than that, but they're outliers. So that comes down to more individual coaching. And we can talk about that if we need to, but we won't get into that. If you look at biomechanics as one of the key features, one of the things that I reckon is interesting, and I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on this, Tom, because people got really enamored, I think, with kinematics, what position you're in.
Yeah.
But I think one of the key features that has nicely started to change because of the research that was being heavily driven by people like Peter Weyand and Ken Clark, J.B. Moran, Nagahara, is that pretty shapes don't necessarily apply forces in the right direction at the right time with the right speed, or right velocity. And you can be ugly, but if you're applying them in those ways, you're probably going to go faster than someone who looks really pretty.
It's like function over form. It's like the classic thing, you go down to an athletics meet and you see everyone warming up, even in Australia, doing drills, warming up. You're like, this bloke looks like he's going to break 10 seconds, you know what I mean? Like, he looks perfect, he looks unbelievable. And he gets out there and runs like 11.2. Even yesterday we had a competition. I was still doing the same thing, and I've been going around comps for over 10 years and seeing these guys, and I'm like, geez, they look great. They look awesome.
And they're in heat 7.
And they're in heat 7 and, can't break 11 seconds. And you're like, what is actually going on here? Because they've obviously been coached to do this. You know what I mean? It's not like they've just gone out and they're doing like a high knee drill or like practicing or emphasising front side mechanics. It's like they've been coached to be put in these positions in the theory to you're going to run faster doing this.
But being in the position doesn't mean that you're actually applying the appropriate forces.
And do you see that as a common mistake where you think that mechanics can compensate for not actually running at high speeds? And do you think that's the common component that's missing?
I think it's because it's observable. People as coaches and as athletes, they get attached to looking pretty. Right? And it's easy to do. Like, it's a mistake that I've made. I think it's a mistake that everyone's made.
Yeah.
You're like, oh, that looks really good on the slow-mo or really good on the still shot. And it's like, that doesn't matter. What matters is what the clock says when you finish.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter what you look like. You can be as pretty as hell and run slow as shit.
Yeah.
Like, it doesn't. That's another. And I mentioned this a couple of weeks ago when we were talking about sprinting. I think when we spoke to your brother, actually.
Yeah, it came up.
The cool thing about athletics in particular is, like, at the end of the day, all the bullshit gets fucking brought up because the result matters.
So with that in mind, like, I realise there's so many different variables and caveats here, but do you think for the untrained individual or even for like the team athlete, do you need to focus more on just exposing them to high speeds at a regular basis in order to build that capacity?
So I think let's get into that. There's 3 phases to any sprint, right? Even 1 to 400, right? Yeah. The acceleration, and you can break that into more phases. The top speed phase, and then the speed maintenance phase, all right? And obviously, the length or the duration of those varies from a 60 meter, 100 meter, 200 meter, 400 meter, all right? If you look at the acceleration, the components are the same in every one of those events. The key things that you're trying to do is you're going from 0 velocity and you're trying to accelerate yourself to your maximum velocity. Now, what you tend to see And this is something that I know that one of the coaches that people would know about speaks, like a guy named Lawrence Seagrave spoke about in a podcast from many years ago. But his theory, and I think it's based on the data that they collected over a long period of time, was everyone takes about 6.5, 7 seconds to hit their top speed.
Like
right?
top tier.
No,
not top tier.
doesn't matter. You can be a 5-year-old kid.
Yeah.
Right? However, the distance that you'll cover to get to your top speed in 6.5 seconds is very different.
Yeah.
So if you're 10 years old, you might only go 30 meters.
Yeah.
But you'll be your top speed.
Yeah.
If you're Safa Powell, at his best, he's going
60.
65 meters by then, or something like that, right?
Yeah.
What's the rationale behind that? Has anyone have you heard any
I don't
explanation?
know. I have thought about this a bit, and I think in my mind, and I'm completely pulling this out of nowhere, is it takes about that amount of time for your brain to create maximum sort of outflow of some of those centrally driven features. Things like frequency firing rates, of the actual motor, like the motor messaging.
And then the reinforcement things like persistent inward currents and all that stuff.
And all of those things to be stabilized.
Yeah.
And I think I toyed with this idea, and this probably sounds like a really dumb idea, of trying to see whether you could extend that by getting people to do things like isometric mid-thigh pulls for as long as they could.
Yeah.
Oh,
right?
okay.
And seeing if you could, over time, I feel like it would be so taxing. You're doing 10 seconds and then having a rest and come back, and you'd be I think you'd be really fatigued from it. But it's almost seeing if you can get your brain to keep sending messages at the highest level possible for a really long time.
Sure.
So the feature of that I think is important is in acceleration, you're going from zero, and what you need to do is you need to get yourself traveling in a forward direction.
Yep. Cross a track.
All right? Basic physics of it are you apply equal and opposite forces, you'll get a result, right? What you need to do is you need to project yourself forward, so therefore you need to push backwards, which in general terms is meaning that you're trying to apply forces more horizontally, right? Now, that's a relative feature, because what happens is over time, as you get faster and closer to your maximum speed, you are no longer able to keep generating more speed, and therefore your torso or your whole body shifts from being more horizontally orientated to more vertically orientated. And the typical number that everyone will put out there, and it's based actually on projectile motion, is 45 degrees.
Yeah.
Right? So if you want to maximize, all things being equal, if you want to maximize the distance that a projectile moves, you'll initiate the shot from 45 degrees. Right? However, depending on things like your body shape, your anthropometrics, your strength, your power, your limb lengths, all those things, some people will be lower than that. And you tend to find people who are, say, shorter and have shorter torsos can actually project a little bit lower, right? Particularly if they're very powerful. So the example would give someone like a Christian Coleman.
Yeah.
You can project as low as, say, 37 degrees, right? And then you have taller people with longer levers, longer features who don't have the power. And the reason that they can't go lower is because if they try and project the amount of power that they would need to project themselves far enough forward to be able to keep that orientation and not fall over with that amount of body weight over.
I was just about to say the lever arm of their centre of gravity relative to their base of support.
Exactly.
Is
so different that it means that they can't actually produce enough power to do that. So therefore, that's why you find taller sprinters like a Usain Bolt, or even more recently someone like a Reece Prescott, cannot actually produce the angle that someone like a Christian Coleman can. However, it doesn't mean that they can't produce the speed, because if you look at, say, the world record performances, we had recently at the 2021 Olympics, you had a Chinese sprinter, short guy, he's 5'7", 5'8", Su Bingtian run officially the fastest 60 metres ever recorded, fastest 30 metres ever recorded, 373, and then he went 629.
Yeah.
But there are unofficial records of Bolt going through his world record in 629.
There is, yeah.
Right? Which shows he's not slow in his acceleration. It just looks different.
Yeah.
And the way that he achieves it is slightly different.
For sure.
Right?
Different
With the
function.
frequencies and the spatiotemporal stuff. So I know I'm hijacking this podcast, so I apologise for.
But I think what you're saying is like you get these numbers and you get this data like 45 degrees and these perfect positions and angles, but there's always
a starting point.
Absolutely, it's always a starting point you take with a grain of salt, because I've never ever seen anyone run exactly the same, and I don't think you ever will, because everyone's always built that slightly different power levels, different things that they've just developed over time. So you can never really just put a cookie cutter mold on people.
No.
You have to build, maybe you might lean one way, like, oh, this person needs a little bit more front side, this person needs a little bit more strength to get the angles, You constantly have to individualise and build towards those.
That's coaching feature of coaching, yeah.
But I was going to ask then too, how do you determine what's optimal biomechanics for that individual then?
Well,
it's the result.
Yeah.
You always go back to result.
I think this is the key thing, right? So like if we go to what are you trying to achieve with an acceleration? What you're trying to achieve is actually hitting the highest top speed you can.
Yeah.
That's the point of an acceleration. So people make the mistake often in acceleration. They're really quick in the first 20 or 30 meters, but then the rest of their race sags.
Yeah.
Right? And it's like, that's not an effective acceleration, right? It may achieve the value of getting to 30 meters really quickly, but you actually haven't set up the rest of your race.
Yeah.
So if we go back to the kinetic features related to it, not just the kinematic, which is your body positions, what we see is actually the data is really clear now. There's two forms of data that have been developed. One was initially developed by an instrumented treadmill with the work of the French team led by JB Morin, that showed that the people who hit the highest top speeds were the ones that actually produced the highest horizontal impulses across their acceleration. So when we say impulse, it's basically, it's a measure of area under the curve, and what that is a multiple of the amount of force that you're creating over the duration of time.
And so what you're saying there is, when you think about that interplay between stride frequency and stride length, you're going to see variability, because some people might have really high stride frequency but lack stride length, but they still have good impulse because
they're applying the forces. The amount of forces they're putting into the ground in a certain amount of time. Right? And the cool thing with sprinting is you're actually very time limited with how much time you can spend on the ground. Right?
Yeah.
If you're moving slower, you can spend more time on the ground. It's usually one of the errors people make. They don't spend enough time on the ground in the acceleration. Some people too much, but generally they don't spend enough time, because when you're going slow, you actually need to generate force. So you need to put force into the ground. Once you're moving quickly, the velocity that you're moving at allows you to impart forces with really high velocities and very high actual magnitudes because of the velocity that you're moving at. And it becomes, we've spoken about this before, but it comes very much from a muscle contraction driven task, and a power driven task, to a much more elastic sort of...
My subconscious almost,
Well, and I guess part of that too is you're actually trying to build up larger ground reaction forces, essentially.
And we'll get to upright in a moment, but basically what they found was that those people produce more horizontally directed impulses at greater magnitudes for longer, right? So that was the key feature. That came out in about 2012, right? And that actually used Christophe Lemaitre in their research. So they had a 992 sprinter that was part of that. Then the work of Ryu Nagahara out of Japan it's just fucking phenomenal. It's by far the best sprinting research that we've got. He doesn't get as much. He's starting to now because he's doing work with some of these guys in North America and Europe. But his research is fucking phenomenal. And the reason it's phenomenal is because it creates the data from using about 50 meters of force plates that they've got lined up on an sort of half indoor, half outdoor sort of track. So the quality of that data is amazing. And they've shown a very similar thing. There's actually a few sections to your acceleration, and there's switch points where you see changes in the frequency and the exchange rate happen of your limbs. You see the direction of the force change. But generally what you find is people who run faster tend to apply greater impulse in the horizontal direction, and they can continue to do that for longer than someone who can't hit a higher top speed, right? Then we get to top speed, which is once you've actually started to transition.
Well, actually, before you go to that, having this conversation makes me think of about when you say improving sprint ability, what do we mean by sprint itself? Because, for you guys, you work a lot more in track, but I'm thinking about for people working with fields, with team sports or ball sports.
Yeah.
Is sprinting really just related more to acceleration and deceleration?
That's the biggest load of bullshit that's been pushed around, particularly strength and conditioning circles. And as someone who has a degree in strength and conditioning, to all you strength and conditioning coaches, if you don't know what you're doing, don't try and teach sprints, please, because it's fucking annoying.
Oh, right? And even on that point with like coaching, like sprinting and stuff like that, if you don't understand why an athlete is doing something and you're trying to change it, you are so far off the mark, it is not funny. I've seen cases where people are trying to change like step width and acceleration on a good accelerator because it doesn't
look
like nice. You shouldn't be going left and right.
But it's an issue of the aesthetics again.
But not understanding why they're doing it.
Not understanding why the function.
I think it's worth going back to your point here, John. Like, what's missing then in regards to developing sprint ability and max velocity?
Again, an acceleration, and even for people who are playing on a field, right? So there's two features in this, and it's something that gets talked a lot about by people who work particularly in, say, like NFL, right, or the development of that, because there's lots and lots of programs, there's lots and lots of like stuff you see on YouTube, and they talk about quickness, right? Yeah. And you see all these people using ladders and quick foot drills.
All about building up frequency.
It's the biggest waste of time ever, right? If you look at, I think probably the person who's doing this the absolute best, a guy named Les Spellman, right?
That's good work.
He's fantastic for people who want to look at sprint stuff online. He's got really good quality stuff. He's not talking about being quick. He's not saying to people, don't apply horizontal forces in your acceleration. If you look at a lot of the drills that he does, a lot of acceleration type exercises, a lot of the actual running that they do, he wants you to impart high forces. Yes, he wants you to actually use high velocity movements of your limbs, but he wants you to impart high velocity, high magnitude forces into the ground. He's not asking you to tap the ground.
No, not at all. Not at all. And I think one of the things that Les does really well is that he really breaks it down. Like he'll break it for NFL guys or people going to the combine, he'll break down step one. Like one step. Once you do one step, he goes, all right, let's do two step. Two step. And he'll just keep drilling like from just the smallest little sections and just perfecting movement.
And so I think that the key thing with acceleration is learning how to impart forces horizontally. It's not an easy thing to do. And there's two reasons that it's not easy. One is you actually need to be very powerful to do so, right? But two, and it's something that you brought up before, is there's an enormous amount of intent that's required both in the aggressiveness of what you're doing, and also there's a fear factor because you need to project yourself. You need to pretend you are a projectile object and project yourself in space aggressively, which most people don't know how to do because it's a very foreign concept.
We get a fear response.
Yeah, you do.
Like
you're going to fall.
Yeah, you're going to fall. Like you need to literally be on that tilted edge of like, am I going to fall or am I going to maintain balance? And when you get that angle right, you're just going as horizontal as you possibly can. Because if you go one angle too far, your torso's down or the shin drops, you're going to tumble.
Well, and so the reason that I'm saying that acceleration is not the key is because there's also a relative problem that tends to occur, which is the higher your top speed, the faster your acceleration is. Right?
Yes. Yeah, that's proven.
And because again, you're sort of stuck. Well, not stuck, but you're always going to be within that constraint of 6.5 to 7 seconds. To
exactly.
Get to
and so
speed.
The interesting thing with it too is you tend to see people who spend a lot of time doing acceleration. If you just do acceleration work, it doesn't necessarily mean that, say, your speed will be better.
Yeah, sure.
Right? But if you do just top speed work, your acceleration can get better, which is the crazy part about it. Right, and there's coaches that have shown that over and over using it's empirical data. It's theirs, and they collect it themselves. But they've shown it and published it over time to show, even if we don't work on acceleration, if we work on top speed, we tend to get improvements in our acceleration.
Interesting. And I guess also too, with a lot of team sports, you're not going to be you're limited to how much time you can spend in that angle. Because if it's a contact sport or you're playing soccer,
you need to have your head up. You need to have the ability.
Exactly.
So you are accelerating. You are trying to apply forces, but ultimately, what you're trying to do is you're trying to expand the their velocity window, their maximal velocity window. And the concept that people will understand who even come from more, say, distance running, all those things, is speed reserve, right?
Yeah.
If your maximal speed is higher, it's like having a much higher maximal speed for speed reserve reasons. We see that with, obviously, Gareth Sanford talks about a lot of this stuff. I really like it. Talks about like how your maximal sprint speed is really important for your MAS numbers.
Yep.
The work of
Martin Boucher
as well. Like, they talk a lot about, you need to calculate those things, because if your top speed is 10 meters per second versus someone who's 8 and you play on the same soccer team, you shouldn't be prescribing, even though they've got the same MAS value, you shouldn't be prescribing the same distance, for instance, for their features, because that person's going to be going so much easier than the other one.
Yeah.
And
it's just
the same
efficiency at the speed,
Yeah.
And if you had those two guys, one with a 10 metre per second top speed and one with 8, and get them both to run at 7, who's going to outlast the other one?
It's the relative intensity.
Yeah, isn't it? Of course.
Exactly. So I think that's the key feature that you kind of need to understand with why you can't just work on acceleration for team sports. You need to work on top speed.
Yeah, okay.
Right? And we actually see that even too, because it's a relative thing. Like right now, obviously, we're recording this, it's not going to come out for a month or so, but like the World Cup's on.
Yeah.
Everyone knows the fastest player is Kylian Mbappe, right? But if you look at his top speed, it's also the best out of all of the players when you measure the GPS data, right? Who wins every acceleration? Him, right? The reason is his top speed is so high, it means his acceleration is also quick. Yeah. And there's this stupid concept that people think, I can have a fast acceleration even though I'm slow at top speed. Yeah. And you can fudge the numbers a little bit. And the way you do it is by, as I said, that quickness stuff we spoke about. Like, you can really increase your frequency. Yeah. You can really try and move your limb velocities really quickly. But you're actually losing out, because you can get a greater improvement in your acceleration by working on top speed features, as well as obviously acceleration mechanics and force application.
Yeah. I was going to say, why do you think you get that transfer? Like, why do you think, is that because you're actually exposing yourself to very high limb speeds with very high ground reaction forces, and that does transfer back into acceleration?
Yes, but I think there's a huge coordinative capability that comes with actually exposing yourself as well to the top speed.
I think even the way that you train it. So if you're training acceleration, you might run 20, 30 metres and that's your rep done. But if you're training top speed and say you introduce fly work or even faster reps over 60, 70, 80 metres, you have to go through the acceleration phase to get to top speed. So you're doing it without even, you can't just be like, we're doing like an 80 metre rep and it's just top speed. You're actually practicing acceleration and top speed.
Yeah.
Whereas when you do acceleration training, it's just acceleration.
And I mentioned the other element to that too is you're also training that transition from being at this angle to being at that angle. And the reality is, again, going back to thinking of team sports, you're going to be in this position for a lot of the time. Because if you're going into contact, you're typically not going to do that. Or if you're running with the ball.
I had a soccer kid come and do some training with me just to work on his running technique from a physio. He got him to come down. And that kid was a good soccer player, or reportedly a good soccer player. I never saw him play. But I go, just run. We did a warm-up and just run 20 metres as fast as you can. I swear to God, he took probably 12 steps in the first 10 metres. And you could just see that was something that he used as a strategy in his gameplay, where he would use 10 or 12 quick steps, limb speed, to get to the position. He'd get the ball and then he'd play. But he didn't understand acceleration at all. And it was just a fascinating thing that it was a strategy that he used to get the job done in play. And at the end of the day, we could make him better, but if he's playing soccer well using that strategy, we don't want to take him away from that. Yeah. We just want to give him more options. And maybe you can use a strategy where you can put 2 or 3 long steps in, create some space, then you go to frequency as you come up. But we never really got to continue on with him. But creating options for team sport players is a huge way to just build a overall better athlete.
Perhaps we stay on talking about acceleration and thinking about those 3 key components. We've talked a fair bit about biomechanics. I think the other really big one is tissue capacity. For the undeveloped individual with a lack of exposure to acceleration training in itself, where do you think you need to start in regards to, do you focus on purely biomechanics? Are you going to actually build up their capacity in the gym to be able to create horizontal forces? And what guidelines or what kind of process do you go through to determine what you need to work on?
If you're really stripping it down, I would make sure they've got like good movement capacity to start off with. So make sure they've got good range. They can do like basic compound lifts well. And then I'll just get them running, because everyone's run. Like most of them have played sport for a certain amount of years. You're not getting completely blank slate, and just see where they're at, see what they can do. Like I said, with that kid, like we only did like 2 or 3 sessions together, but the first session was show me what you got. Like you've been playing soccer, you've done this thing. I just want to see how you move and how you achieve a certain goal. Like give me a 20-metre sprint flat out. Start on the ground and, do a flag start and sprint for 20 metres. Let's pull like a little bit of a sled, maybe like 20, 30, maybe even 50% of body weight, and let's see how things change under load. Okay. And then you can start building the steps. Like that's obviously highly specific, one-on-one training.
Yeah.
But I think looking at those things, another thing, not to harp on this kid too much, but his ankle function and his ability to use like the forefoot and his calf and the elastic complex around the Achilles was terrible. Like so terrible. Like he would just land full foot, even the acceleration. Like he would like just land, bang, 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 and just keep going. So that was where I was sort of heading, creating length, teaching him like positional work, and then starting to like strengthen up the ankle complex using isometrics, teaching position, holding. You could do like wall squats, like heel raises. You could do. I know Chris Corfus is a big one that I always refer back to. Spring ankle isometrics, just holding like a quarter squat with heels off the ground, varying the height of the heel, and just doing it for time, double leg, single leg.
Well, more specifically then, when you think about that relationship between mechanics and tissue capacity with sprinting, whether it's acceleration, upright, how much direct transfer do you think you get? Do you actually think that do you see specific changes to their running mechanics from just working purely on their tissue capacity? Like, i.e. building up strength, range of movement, things like that in the gym?
The correlation is interesting. So, all things being equal, you would take someone who knows how to use what they have more than someone who has more but doesn't know how to use it, if that makes sense. So if you have someone who's really powerful, if they don't know where to direct it and at what time to direct those forces into the ground, they're basically useless to you.
Yeah, okay.
And that's why you get people who have very little formal kind of strength training or power training who can run really fast. And there have been lots of examples of people who've done almost no strength training who've reached the top levels of performance.
Yeah.
Right? And what they're really good at doing is being able to produce high levels of particularly power and elastic function and apply them in the right direction at the right time.
Yeah.
And if you have those features, then you're very lucky, right? Because what you can do is you can build on top of that with tissue capacity features. The biggest trick that you tend to have to, because people get caught in that, but it always comes down to, we spoke about, the exercise classification.
Yeah.
How many steps away are you from the competitive exercise? So the competitive exercise, everyone, we've spoken about a million times, the Bondarchuk sort of hierarchical pyramid, but the competitive exercise is the key thing. You need to be able to practice sprinting and actually do so in a way that develops your capability of applying those forces in the right time, right direction, in the right stress, environment, all of those features. The next part is, how do you get transfer from what you're doing, whether it's overloading, underloading, or playing with that, to actually continue to develop those features? So a really common one that people use for acceleration that we've spoken about before actually in our Instagram Live is things like sleds or pushing, pulling, it might be some resisted running, hills. Yeah. Because what that does is that teaches you how to, it does two things. It can develop power that is specific to the task, right? But not the same as the task. And then what it does is it allows you to teach you how to develop some of, say, the skill component. So the cool thing about doing, say, varied weights on a sled or a prowler or changing the angle of your heel is, if you make it really heavy, you learn really quickly which way is horizontal.
Yeah.
Because you're not going anywhere.
It won't move.
Right? then as you slowly make it lighter, you teach them to be able to orientate their position and still use that amount of horizontal pushing, right? But the timing is really different, because if you go with a really heavy sled, say even up to 100% of body weight, you can spend forever on the ground if you want, because you're not going to fall over. The weight is counterbalancing your trunk position.
Oh, for sure. It's just the balance of force and velocity. You know, if you're pulling that heavy sled, it's more force dominant. As you get gradually less and less and get to body weight, it's more velocity dominant.
And you just brought up the key feature. You know, a good friend of ours is a guy named Dylan Hicks, and he actually has done some of his PhD work on looking at the force velocity profile and how to develop that and how to look into that. And there's obviously cool things. There's like some apps now that allow you to do it. That, like My Sprint, that's not expensive, and it allows you to calculate something like your force velocity curve. And basically what it tells you is you can apply forces and you're good at producing high amounts of force output, but the velocity is not high enough, or vice versa. And it's that whole equation of power and strength. And obviously, as you go faster, that elastic function. And what you find with acceleration, for instance, it's probably only the first, I would say, maximum 3 steps that are influenced by maximal strength.
Because, you know, you always hear about these correlations of like weightlifters would be able to accelerate, have amazing acceleration capacity.
Well, the reason that they can is not because their strength is high. It's usually because their power is high.
Sure.
Yeah.
Between maybe the third step and I would say maybe 15, 20 meters, right, is power. And how much power you can produce, right? And if you can direct it horizontally at least.
For sure.
Then from then on, right, from 20 meters on, it's about how you transition that power to very high rate of force development tasks like elastic function.
Yeah.
Right? So that's why you can find people who are really powerful, really strong, they'll be really good accelerators, but then the wheels fall off, right? And there's usually 2 reasons for that. One is they haven't actually developed some of those elastic features, but 2, maybe they don't know how to orientate in the right direction.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Well, and I think this is actually something that's worth also diving a bit into is, like, when you're talking about elastic function, what is it, and how do you actually develop elastic function? Because
do you want to do that as we go into? I think we need to sort of we're already 47 minutes in, so we should probably transition to talking about top speed, because I think it's
that's
relevant.
where it actually really comes a bit. Yeah.
Well, I think like we could probably use this as a bit of a segue. Like you brought up Olympic lifters and like even power lifters to a certain extent. Like I look at it as like hip, knee, ankle, and like we all know powerlifters, squat, deadlift, bench. There's not a lot of ankle development going on there. Like it's a lot of knee and hip. Okay, and like those guys will be the guys who, and even weightlifting says they get a little bit of more than powerlifters. Olympic lifters get that extension, that quick reversal, drop down and catch it. So you'd almost hypothesize that like powerlifters would be the worst, Olympic lifters are going to be the next sort of fastest, and then like sprinters are going to be the best. And you look at what the sprinters do, and even in the top speed, ankle is so important. Your foot function, your ankle function, the ability to jump, that is something that like you just have to have. And if you don't have that, then you're not going to be able to apply the forces in the quick enough time to extend from the first, like we say, 3 to 15 metres to keep building that speed up. So I think that's the one way we could sort of get into max velocity training. You can build on that.
The thing that changes, so if we build on that, the thing that changes from acceleration to top speed is your orientation of your forces, right? Your forces become much more vertically orientated, right? Because at that point, you can't go any faster. So you're not going to be able to, continue to push horizontally with any, significant amount.
We're not going to re-accelerate.
No, right? So you've attained what you can. Most of your force is going to be orientated vertically. And I want to talk about this in a moment because it's something that I think needs to be discussed, because I think there's an error going on in how people have interpreted some of the research. But what you're trying to do is continue to apply very high forces in a very short amount of time. And the key thing with that is that means that it shifts into, if you look at the force velocity spectrum, much more towards the velocity end. And that in itself, once you get beyond, we've spoken about early and late RFD, once you get into the realm of, say, under, it always varies, 250, 200 milliseconds, under 150 milliseconds, which and for a contact time, we're looking at under 100 milliseconds, you're very much working in the elastic zone. And what we mean by that is you're using your connective tissue structures, right, to reflexively be able to create force. You're not contracting your tissue. Even there's this idea that there's like an isometric contraction that happens. If you were doing that, you would get so much, you would end up in a position where you'd be locking down your joints so much, you would almost create rigidity.
Yeah.
And you wouldn't go anywhere. So you're not trying to create isometric contractions when you hit the ground.
Rigidity kills speed.
Yeah.
And it causes injuries.
And I think the thing to highlight there is thinking about the magnitude of the ground reaction forces itself, because we're talking about magnitudes of body weight far greater than what the actual muscle can create.
Exactly.
So part of this is about how you actually utilize potential energy into kinetic energy. Yeah. And what is it about talented sprinters, do you think, that allows them to actually do that?
Well, this is where it's a great segue, Jack, because this brings in the research. So a lot of this has exploded since, I think, Ken Clark did his PhD under Peter Weyand at Southern Methodist Uni in Texas. He must have started in early 2010s. Around 2012, 2014, they started publishing a lot of papers looking at force application in elite sprinters versus other sports. Now, what they found was elite sprinters did something unique that they hadn't observed before and actually went against what people thought happened, particularly in the tracing of the ground reaction force, which was people thought that we used our tendons like springs. The interesting thing was, and there's a paper that's actually titled something along this, is like, you know, we don't use the ground reaction like a spring, right? And the way I say that is, it's the way that it actually presents is there's a huge initial spike, then it drops, then you see the normal spring function. Whereas with slow people, they put their foot on the ground and you see a normal curve that looks like a parabola.
Like a nice bell curve.
Yeah, like a negative parabola that actually is very much like a spring. So what they're doing is they're hijacking their spring and they're souping it up. And the way that you do that is by accelerating your foot into the ground really aggressively and try and stay really stable on that ankle, right? If you do that, you get this huge initial spike. And as you said, the ground reaction forces that they were finding were 4 to 5 times body weight in both males and female elites. Whereas someone who was running at their maximum, but they might have been like a soccer player, was going to maybe 3.5 times body weight, and jogging was 2.5 to 3 times. So what they found was, okay, these guys are using a different methodology, and the methodology was really accelerating that, what they call a thigh angular velocity, and smacking their foot into the ground aggressively. And if you watch top sprinters sprint and you're there, the thing that you notice the most, right, is actually the sound. The sound is so unique because you can hear they actually whack the ground really quickly. It's kind of like you can hear them like really aggressively hitting the ground. And some people do it better than others, where you can tell it's being directed in the right way, and then other people really slap, which means that they're kind of probably going almost too vertical. Yeah. And the reason that I say there's an issue with what's going on with that interpretation of vertical is if you listen to the research that someone like Ken Clark talks about and how he uses it for his coaching, he talks about all vertical. And I actually think he's wrong. And the reason that I think he's wrong is because their research was done on an instrumented treadmill, where the treadmill actually moves at the speed that you need to go at, which I think causes a major issue, which is it highly under assesses the horizontal component that happens when you're running over the ground.
You don't have to propel yourself forward,
So I think one of the big things that we're seeing that's a mistake is too many people have interpreted, and I'm putting that hat on and saying, I fucked this up. I think that we spent too much and have put too much weight on going really vertical in the upright. It's mostly vertical, probably at more than 80%. But there still has to be some horizontal component to it. Because if you don't, unless you're the most elastic person in the world, which...
Like in terms of short contact times, you mean?
Some people, that Tobago kid from Botswana
exactly.
or something like that.
But even then, he has so much backside mechanics.
He does.
It tells me that he's using a lot of horizontal
It's almost an inverse relationship from like the acceleration, where predominantly horizontal, minimal vertical. There's always
it's like an 80-20
thing,
and it switches over
and
it happens gradually.
For sure.
Right? So from that kinematic point of view, you see that change in the orientation of the torso and the shin angle. And from a kinetic point of view, you see the same thing. You see a shift from, as I said, mostly horizontal or a lot of horizontal to a lot of vertical.
Yeah.
Right? So that's the key component. And what they find is if you can produce really high vertical forces in a very elastic way, in which you're doing it with very fast, high impulses, right? You tend to be able to run at very, very high speeds. And that's why, as Tom mentioned before, the elastic component of knowing how to, and I don't know that you need to know how to jump, actually. I'm gonna say that. I think that some people work at how to do it in a very unique context, but can't do it in others. The cool thing about if you do teach someone to jump and they have that general skill is it can really enhance someone's understanding of what they're doing when they're sprinting across the ground.
And that probably depends on the population group, because I was thinking of, I remember you shared that Twitter response of I can't remember the guy's name, but he put out the data about the rugby union players and looking at RSI and the jump height relative to the max speed, wasn't it, specifically, because everyone associates RSI, i.e. depth jump.
Yeah, as being a measure of stiffness and elastic function.
Correct. But in fact, his data was showing that it was their vertical height, so i.e. how high they could jump over.
Told you who the fastest rugby players were.
Now, I mean, there's specific differences between a rugby player and their
body weight being much higher and all that
versus a sprinter.
But I think that's a similar thing. I think it's contextual. So, like, I've heard lots of stories of sprinters who've done no plyometrics, no jumping ever, and been elite.
Well, then it's always the argument of like sprinting is a plyometric, and almost a purest form of plyometric. You know what I mean?
Yeah, because the contact time is the shortest that you would generally measure, and that's what I mean. Like I'm saying, I think people work out how to do it because they participate in sprinting, but the general skills of jumping will actually transfer as what we would call, if you're looking at that Bondarchuk methodology, a specific preparatory exercise. Yeah. It teaches you skills. It teaches you. And your tissue to be able to adapt to that kind of feature.
It's funny that you mentioned that, because I did have an eye-opening moment working with a basketball player coming off an ACL injury, and we're just in the gym doing some jumping, and I'm like, this guy can dunk, and like seeing his footage of like he was supposed to go over to college ball before he hurt himself. Like, this guy be jumping, like I'll have to take him outside, I won't be able to do it in the garage, he'd be hitting his head on the roof. He's 6'7". And really struggled just with stationary counter movement jumps, single leg jumps, hops on the spot. And I'm scratching my head a couple of weeks, and I'm like, I'll get him to like a power skip or a skip for height at the front of the house. And I've got probably like a 20, 30 metre sort of brick flat area there. I'm like, just do a power skip for me and just skip as high as you can and get across the ground as much. And I couldn't believe like how much distance he was travelling. Like once he built momentum, and that we sort of moved a little bit closer to what dunking was and jumping in a game of basketball, and it was just amazing how we could utilise that.
And I think that shows and that tells you something. And like I remember, I've told this story before on the podcast, but I think it's really relevant, is the story of Stefan Holm.
Yeah, he's crazy.
He was the Olympic champion in 2004, I believe, in the high jump, and he's still got the record for the highest jump over his own height. Like he was 183 and he jumped 238 or 240. And interestingly, when they measured his vertical leap, it was very average for an athlete, right?
You'd expect it to be like something phenomenal. You'd be like, what?
And the other thing that and the reason that they came to was that the only way for him to create the forces that he needed for high jump was to be moving at a velocity that created enough stretch on particularly his lower limb, his Achilles tendon, his calf complex, his knee, his hip, to be able to actually create that amount of vertical projection. Yeah. He couldn't do it using muscular contraction alone. Right? And that's the key thing, is you can't produce these forces trying to contract your tissue.
Yeah, I think the thing it highlights to me too, and tell me if you disagree, but we can think of, say, building tissue capacity, and we can think of doing, say, plyometrics or depth jumps and things like that, and go, oh, it's much more specific to sprinting because it has that stretch shortening cycle. But you probably need to think about it as developing overall power, but its actual specificity to sprinting is still very limited.
Yeah.
It builds a particular capacity that may provide more tools for you to be able to create different patterns in how you run, but don't look at it as having much direct transfer, essentially.
Yeah, and I think that's 100% right. I think that's the key feature that you're talking about. Is like when you even said, what tissue capacities you need to develop, like understand that they're tools, but they're not sprinting.
No.
Right? And if you've got more of those tools and you know how to sprint, great, you're going to do well. But if you don't know what you're doing with the tools that you've got, like, it's not going to work.
No.
When this is actually...
There's no point buying a new drill if you don't know how to turn it on.
No, not at all.
To actually backtrack a bit, because we've talked about biomechanics, but I guess the question then comes, and I think this myself as strength and conditioning coach, is I haven't developed a good knowledge of sprint mechanics until I started talking to guys like you, is what are the things that we need to look at when we actually teach acceleration? Because what are the things that will, probably more specifically, do you see common mistakes made by strength and conditioning coaches or for developing sprint ability overall?
I don't know specifically for strength and conditioning, just generally, like even track coaches do the same thing.
Yeah.
Because we've talked about angles and things like that, but I mean, how do we actually think about that in the setting?
If you want to answer, go for it. But there's always a really thing that I always remember back to, and I've referred to him many times in here. But Dan Pfaff talks about, like, if you want to know what a good acceleration is, right? Like, what you should see is that there's a uniform increase in the body angle change. There's a uniform increase in the stride length. There's a uniform increase in the stride frequency. If you see all of those things happen in a very uniform and consistent way, then that's generally going to be a good acceleration.
Yeah.
What you tend to see in people who don't do it well is it's very staccato. It's like down, then up, then down again, and then all of a sudden their frequency is really high and then it drops off.
Or the opposite,
So what you should generally see is each step gets longer. Each step gets longer. Each step gets faster. Your contact time gets shorter. Stride length gets longer. Like all of these things.
Flight time gets higher.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So like if you see this uniform change, then you're on a winner, and that's what your aim should be. If you're someone who is coaching this kind of stuff in a general sense, right, or you've got limited knowledge, if you just meet those features, like did each step get longer? Did each contact get shorter? Did the frequency rise throughout? Was there uniform change in their body position? If you've done all of those things, then they're actually accelerating in a reasonably good manner from a visually kinematic point of view.
For sure.
And spatiotemporal point of view.
And then the other part too is, and this is a gross generalization, I realise, but in your observations, do you think athletes are exposing themselves enough to running fast? Because it seems like the other part of the equation is you've just got to expose yourself to high speeds.
I think they are, but you have to have some form of feedback. Like, you can't just run fast.
Just go, okay, I want you to go 100%.
Yeah, I just it goes way back to when we started about learning about intensity. Like, if you have timing lights or some type of timing, hand time, free lap is very popular where you can measure splits. That is instant feedback on, okay, I ran, let's talk about flies for a second. We'll get on with the max velocity. 40 metre build up, 10 metre fly zone. Right, build up your speed as much as possible. As soon as you hit those cones, you go as fast as you can between 10 metres and we'll get a time. The athlete might do the first one and they run, let's just make it even 1 second. You go, okay, sweet, how'd that feel? Oh yeah, felt pretty good, was going relatively hard. You're like, okay, sweet, let's do another one. They build up the intensity again, 0.98. Okay, cool. Going again, 0.95. You're like, okay, well, that's the session done. You start getting feedback for the athlete on what fast for them feels like.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? I think that's a big connection that they need to have is like, what does fast feel like for me? And once you can feel that, once you can accept that, then you can start putting that in a competitive setting, whether it's a training partner's in a training group or you're actually in a race setting. And you're like, okay, if I can get this feeling in the race, I know that this is my fastest. And then you just express that and hold on to it.
This might seem like a stupid, obvious thing, but what is it that people need to do to run fast? Is it just intent? Like, do you just think people just actually need to have more intent and more aggression when they actually attempt to run fast?
Not necessarily, I wouldn't say aggression, but definitely emotion. Like if you're looking at intent, and this can be applied to any exercise or sport.
It requires a maximal output.
Yeah, maximal output. Like there's a guy, Jay Schroeder, who I've looked at a lot of his work, and he talks about like an acronym PIPES. And it like talks about physical, intellectual, psychological, emotional, and spiritual. And if you can apply that to an exercise or some component of that to the exercise, like the thing I remember, Jack, is like a very simple one we used to speak about is like doing a dead hang and seeing how long an athlete can hang for. And you mentioned stuff like, oh, imagine there's like daggers underneath you, you know what I mean? Because you when you're talking about maximal, like you're hanging up there and it's burning, and you're like, oh, you get this little voice in your head and it's like, I've got to let go, I can't hold on. But you can. Like if you really thought there was daggers underneath you, you might squeeze out another 30 seconds, a minute. And with sprinting, like you have to be prepared. Like if you're really serious about trying to reach maximal intensity, you have to be prepared to have your hamstring block apart. Like that's a level that you have to go to. Like you have to be prepared to squeeze every little second out of yourself, every inch of thing in that 10 second, 6 second, 20 second period of time. That's when you know you're at maximal intent. And that might be, yeah, like I said, like emotional, physical, psychological.
I think the interesting thing is a lot of people, and this is a challenge I think as a coach, is a lot of people, you uniquely, I think, because of the environment that you developed your understanding in as an athlete, but also to your personality, that has not only, and you've also explored it and developed those things, so you can do that yourself.
Yeah.
Right? I think a lot of people, and I've struggled with this as from a coaching perspective, is you have to sometimes put a lot of external feedback into what people do so that they can create that, whether that be, as you said, timing, or being competitive with their training partners, or putting them into a race situation. And interestingly, one of the things that I'm finding, and it's an aside, we won't go into it, but is with your more experienced athletes, sometimes they can't even hit these intensities until they're in races that they feel are more important.
Yeah.
Right? Which is an interesting place to be, because for them, until it gets to that level of like, oh, this is the national championships or a track classic or I'm overseas, they're actually contextually said their emotional attachment to it's not there, so they can't actually reach that level of intensity.
Oh, for sure. It's
and that's
understanding the psychology of your athletes, like from a coaching point of view. And we haven't mentioned it, but like for the last 2 or 3 years, like I've self-coached myself and been a sprinter, so like almost like having two minds going at the same time, because sometimes I'm coaching myself and then other times I'm like being the athlete. And when you start sort of delving into that, you get a really good understanding of what you need to do to get the job done. And like I couldn't like fathom the idea of even, or not fathom the idea, but particularly going to like the top tier, like the Olympic Games, 100 meter final, like that is it. Like you can't really get any high energy, higher excitement. Like it's almost like the ultimate goal. And I can definitely see how athletes who have been exposed to that would struggle then to go back and just do like a weekend meet and perform at that same level, because you are like absorbing like all the external environments that I would call it extra, because I think that you don't want to rely on those things to bring up a performance. Like I feel like you should be able to almost bring that up through yourself rather than rely on, like we used to joke about, like when I first started running, like rent a crowd. Like, oh, you need to rent a crowd, like you need your family, your friends, and like a big crowd there and everyone cheering you on to actually bring a performance out of you. And like I see that as a weakness. Like if you need that to produce a performance, then that's not always going to be there. You know what I mean? Like you need to eventually realise, like, hang on, like when I'm ready, I just need the track.
I think the other thing this highlights too is running fast requires your maximal intent and intensity, and that might seem obvious, but if I think of, say, conditioning, like building up metabolic capacity, you can just go out for a long run, and if you feel like shit, you can still just keep running because you're running at a sub-maximal velocity, and you just got to do the kilometers of volume to do that.
Yep.
But with sprinting, it's the complete opposite, because you actually need to figure out, what do I need to do for that individual to allow them to be at that maximal
it's a great point.
capacity? Because and that highlights something you said before, John, of there's only so much you can actually do of it within a week without actually breaking it.
In terms of, and that gets onto like the training load stuff. I think the key thing is that you need to expose people to running fast. We know it's protective for things like hamstring injury. We know it's protective for injury overall. You probably need to be careful, as Tom mentioned before. Like if you're measuring things, you can kind of tell when the quality drops off. So if you go like, if you kept going, for instance, on this 10 meter fly example, you'd have like 1 second, 0.98, 0.95, and then it might go out again like 0.98, 102, 105, and it's like, okay, you're not getting what you want here.
Within a session,
So you need to be really, really careful to, if you're thinking about developing speed, and there needs to be that level of intent, and there needs to be that level of intensity for there to be brain changes, for there to be skill acquisition of those features, you need to be thinking, okay, if they're fatiguing, I need to cut the session at a certain point.
Yeah. And on that point, because this is something that I struggled with initially, is watching elite sprinters, how much volume they actually do. Because most people will go like, you're only doing, 3 100-meter sets, reps. It's like, I think a lot of people would look at that and going, well, how are you going to get fit doing that? But actually the intensity of sprinting means that the overall volume you can do, particularly for an undeveloped individual, is actually going to be quite limited.
Yeah.
I think it's like what you just sort of like opening up that question, like the skill of training for like any high intensity sport is your ability to put all your energy into one lift, a 10 meter fly, a short period of time where you put the maximum energy into it rather than over a 1 hour training period or a 2 hour game. That's the clear distinction I see, is like the guys who are very good at it, their ability to put everything they can into 0.95 of a second or 0.90 or a 10-second race or one maximal effort lift.
And look, this is not to say that you can't do higher volumes of things at 90%, 92%, 95%. No. It's just that when you're doing absolute maximal, which for people who are in, say, team sports, they're not going to do... Right, like huge volumes of sprinting in general. They're not going to allocate that much time. You're better off doing 3 30-meter or 40-meter sprints at absolute maximum with full recovery than saying we're going to do 15 of them.
Yeah.
Right, at 85%. You're going to get more out of those 3. Right, but that doesn't mean you can't do a session where you do 15.
No, of course not.
Right, that's another discussion, but it's not necessarily going to transfer to you being faster.
Yeah.
Right, it's going to develop other features, repeat spin ability. Maybe you can practice the skills of acceleration position. Sure. You can develop power. You can develop strength. All of those features. We're not in any way saying you need to coach people in a certain way, but just be understanding of the fact that, like, if you're trying to get faster, there's really not that many repetitions you can do. And the most clear example of this is, as I said, like early season racing. People really struggle to tolerate much more than 1 or 2 races in their first couple of competitions.
Yep.
And you see how sore they pull up and how tired they are. And you think, okay, if I'm asking them to do 2 races and they're giving me this as their response, clearly if I'm giving them 8 reps at 100% maximal intensity over similar distances, that's probably too much.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Another question I've got for you, and again...
Do you want us to get on to speed maintenance?
Okay, yeah, sure. I'll go back to this question a bit later on.
Because I think that ties in with some of this stuff.
Yeah, we've actually talked about developing max speed, but the other element we need to think about then is developing or maintaining speed endurance.
Yeah. So a really cool thing came out because it actually, and this is some nice confirmation bias for me, because I've had this thought for a really long time, and I've said this to people, so a fair bit, but I don't in any way see particularly speed maintenance, even up to, say, 400 meters, as being related to energy system development, right? There is an energy system crossover. So, for instance, particularly for 400, you need to have a level of lactic tolerance that you do, right? However, and it was really cool to see this, it was a tweet the other day by Gareth Sanford, who's done a lot of work in this area, saying that, like, energy is not the limiter of speed maintenance or speed endurance. Mechanical output is, right? And I've said this a lot to people of, like, the reason that people get slower even in 100 meters is not because they're running out of energy.
Yeah.
They're not running out of ATP production because of, lack of anaerobic glycolysis, or their lactate system's not able to produce it after that 6 seconds of CP development, PC stuff, whatever you want to say, right? Has nothing to do with that. What happens is they lose the ability to keep applying forces into the ground at the same magnitude, right? And the reason that I believe that happens is what we spoke about before, is that central outflow, right? And it's that, like, persistent inward current stuff. That actually starts getting limited.
Well, is that then related more to your buffering capacity? Like, you're actually, because you're going to get these it's not actually the energy stores are going low, it's more that you can't clear out all the metabolites that are
So one of the key features, and it's not even metabolites, well, it is a metabolite, but like one of the key problems that you face, and there was talk about this being a drug that people were taking, and I never had it confirmed, but one of the key features is when you have the cross bridges that form between troponin and actin. Yeah, so like, sorry, yeah, and then you get the cross bridge formation. Yeah. You actually require calcium for that cross bridge formation to develop. What happens though is after that's happened and it's detached, the calcium actually floods the cell, and then you require I think it's magnesium pump to be able to reuptake that into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Yeah. But if you do maximal activity, there actually isn't enough time for that calcium to be reabsorbed back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum to be recycled and used for that next contraction.
And the same thing happens at a central level with the persistent inward currents, because one of the big things that drives the essential increase in discharge frequency is the secretion of calcium. But again, you need to have that recycling ability to maintain.
And so one of the problems that you face is you can't recycle it quick enough because that pump is not fast enough to do it. So one of the things I think happens is it's not that you're running out of energy, but you actually can't use the actual fuel or for instance, this substrate of calcium to be able to create those contractions for longer. And there was talk a few years back that one of the drugs that people were taking was calcium reuptake enhancer.
Yeah.
Which is a really interesting idea, because your ability to keep producing the same level of, say, force application to the ground, as we spoke about, the really high ground reaction forces, is going to be the thing that allows you to maintain your speed. Because even in 100 meters, people slow down, even if it's not much, right? So basically between 70 meters and 100, even at the absolute elite level, there's a slight slowdown in the maximal speed that they can attain. And so one of the things that you need to do, and this is why specific, or special endurance runs are important, is you need to learn to be able to keep applying forces at a really high intensity. It's not about necessarily running or the duration of running that you do. What you're needing to practice is, can I keep applying these forces in the right way, at the right time, with the right intensity for longer? And that's one of the key features that you find with, because it's often a really clear example, and I think it's a real problem in Australia. I think we've spoken about this before, but Australia has, particularly I think in sprint culture, it's been an issue. It's changing now, which is nice. But there's been this idea that you should do lots of speed endurance training.
What would, I suppose maybe two examples, what an example of their speed endurance training have you seen, and then what would your example of speed endurance training be? Okay, so
an example would be something like 10-200s.
Yeah.
Right? I'm going to pull out a stupid session, 8-200, 6-200, whatever you want.
On a walk back?
On a 3 minute walk
3 minute
back,
cover, yeah.
Right? Okay. I'm sure you've seen
speed
that
endurance,
before.
Yeah.
Right? And people go, we're doing a speed endurance session. Right? Everyone's done it. I did lots of those sessions. Never got any faster, but I did them.
Yeah.
Right?
You felt tight at the end.
Yeah, I was in a bin afterwards. Right?
What, about 28 second sort of pace?
Yeah, like 28, 30. You start at 30 and they get faster over the course of 6 weeks. And down to whatever, Now, and don't get me wrong, if you do those sessions, it's not a bad thing, because I'll explain why.
There's nothing, that's a very good point. There's nothing wrong with the session.
No. Give me a moment. I'll explain even deeper why it's actually a good session even for elite sprinters to do, right? I'm not even going to say that it's not. I'll explain why it is. But don't think that that's transferring to you being able to run a faster 100 meters, right? A session that's going to allow you to do that is maybe high intensity 70 or 80 meter reps or 90 meter reps or a really fast run over 100 or 110 or 120, right? Something that's in the zone of what you need to be able to do, right? You might do repeats of it, but you need enough recovery so that you're running at 95+% intensity.
Yeah.
Those are the things where mechanically you're matching what you do. you look the same, you're applying the same forces, and you're trying to do that repeatedly. Now, in those, you might allow a little bit more drop-off in terms of the performance than what you got in, say, the maximal speed work, right? But it needs to be pretty close.
Sure.
Right? And this kind of system of methodology was highly popularized by someone like Charlie Francis. It's kind of like it should be 90% up or 70% down, right? Now, I don't fully agree with that, and there's reasons to it, and we've spoken about this even just privately with, skill acquisition and practicing things and all those kind of things. I know that Jonas Dodu, who runs Speedworks and is a really, really knowledgeable guy for people looking at more information about that, talks about this as well. Like that 80% speed can actually be really useful for developing skill sets, right, and practicing things. But if you want to be able to sprint fast and you want to be able to endure it, you need to practice enduring something at that speed or close to, and you need to do enough repetitions of it so that your system can learn, as you said, to be able to deal with some of those byproducts of, what's coming in and happening at the tissue level and what's happening at a central level.
So do you think then that you need to really build speed before you build fitness?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
You should always be working on some level of speed. Now, it doesn't need to be a lot, right? Some people can get away with doing 3 reps of something once a week or once every 2 weeks, and that's enough, right? That changes from individual to individual. What's more important, even if you're not directly doing a lot of speed, is that you're practicing that idea of intent of because and I've made this mistake even recently, so I'm not lecturing to anyone because I fucked this up as well, is you need them to practice actually thinking about the intent of wanting to apply forces and run fast, right? Now, that doesn't actually always need to be, well, it probably should be in running, but it doesn't always even need to be, right? It's just that they need to know, I need to be in the right positions, the reason I say it doesn't need to be in running is you can probably even do it with some drills that you do, right? You can practice certain drills that will teach you to actually be conscious of the idea of the intent that you're creating and the intensity you're creating with that intent, right? So I would say that that's the key feature of it. I want to go back because I want to explain why I think, and we'll probably finish up shortly because we're going pretty decent for time here, but one of the reasons why, if you're someone who's listening to this and going, oh, fuck off, I do that 10 200s and I got faster and all this kind of stuff, why it's not a bad session. The reason it's not a bad session is what that session does is it does develop things like lactate tolerance, buffering, and extra machinery for clearing byproducts. Now, why that's valuable is we know that metabolic stress that's created from that kind of session is not entirely different from the metabolic stress that's created from maximal efforts, right? And when I say the metabolic stress, I'm talking about, as you said, the production of metabolic byproducts within the muscle tissue. And we've been discussing this concept quite a bit, which is, and I've always noticed this, really, really, really fast elite sprinters will produce, I think, way more lactate and way more byproducts and have way more soreness and way more almost, muscle damage than someone who doesn't run as fast.
It's just high stress.
So if you've done some of that training, your ability for your system to tolerate that stress that you've created, both at a really high mechanical level, the thing that those athletes really struggle with is they produce such high mechanical forces and the byproducts are so extensive that you talk to a really fast athlete and they do a maximal sprint, might be a race, and they're I'm so sore. And you're that doesn't make any sense.
But it makes sense from the standpoint of looking at the relationship between fibre typology and your phosphocreatine depletion, because your 2X fibres are much more able to deplete phosphocreatine much more extensively.
And so that's why if you do that kind of training, you are actually developing a tool that's going to be helpful for your overall management of that. But just understand that that is not the thing that's creating the foundation for you to get faster.
Or endure speed.
Right? It's creating a foundation for your metabolic capacity. Right? So if you're doing all of your training based around that kind of concept, you're probably not going to be very fast, right? But that doesn't mean that you can't do that kind of training or that it's not important in the overall development of your training picture or your puzzle.
Yeah.
Right? You might do that in periods of the year, and that's really important for later in the year.
Yeah.
Right? Because you're layering these things on, and that's, people talk about these are features that you need to have, right? Because there's become a concept of train really fast all year round.
Yeah.
And it's not that it doesn't work, it does, but you may be not addressing some of these features which are protective for you later, right? So you've got to be thinking about the whole picture.
Like putting money in the bank.
Yes.
And you can withdraw that.
Understand, though, that if you never go to the point of doing these really fast kind of sessions, right, and you don't do so, I guess...
You never withdraw.
Yeah, exactly. You're never withdrawing. You're never actually developing
Yeah.
some of those other tools that you need.
I look at it very, very simply, and specifically, of course, for the 100 metres is, what is your maximal 10 metre fly? 1 second. Now, let's do a 20 metre fly. You need to achieve 2 seconds for 20 metre fly. If your maximal 10 was 1. Let's go to 30. You must achieve 3 seconds. You know what I mean? That is just the clearest example of
and
you're maintaining that speed and enduring that. And that happens at anything. That's the ultimate goal, to achieve the highest top speed possible and don't drop off.
Yeah, and it's exactly what you said before about even just doing the 10-metre fly, do a 40-metre build into a 10, into a 20, into a 30, and just keep measuring, are they dropping off? If they're not, if they are, they're losing the ability to apply those mechanical forces.
For sure, and you can identify it straight away if you feel like the athlete is healthy and they're durable and they can handle that. You can do a 30-metre fly, get the 10-metre splits if you've got the tools available, and be like, they can't hold on to their speed, so that's a thing we need to address.
Yeah. Well, it highlights too that once you've built the speed, to actually maintain it, you've got to be repeating at that speed.
Yeah.
Or close.
Or very
or
close.
Very
to
close.
it.
Yeah.
All right, I think we've addressed a lot.
I had a lot more questions, unfortunately.
I know. We've gone down
Captain.
many a rabbit hole.
Yeah.
Is there anything else that you did want to ask before we finish up?
One quick question I was interested to hear is thinking about research within sprinting, because one thing from my observations, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, is it seems that coaches rely much more on their empirical evidence and data from their own experiences as opposed to referring to the literature. And that seems to me because the literature in sprinting, when we think about mechanics, when we think about developing it, is still in its infancy.
Yeah.
So is that true? And if so, do you think there's particular areas that need to be further explored for us to understand better the science behind sprinting?
I think you're definitely right. Probably more recently, like Johnny's named a few, like Ken, Clark and Nagahara, I think the research, they're doing better research and using better numbers.
It's much more applicable.
Yeah, whereas before, probably I would say even 10, 15 years ago, there wasn't that much information. I mean, one that sticks out to me is Nagahara talking about step width and acceleration, you know what I mean? And the gradual build up of step width that narrows down as you get from acceleration to max velocity. That stuff wasn't around.
Well, I think the thing that's changed, because I would say there has been, particularly in biomechanics, there has been research for a long time. But what the research is changing to do to be more applicable is it's going from just describing what's happening to starting to look for things that potentially set up opportunities for the ability to coach someone into something. And it's a small variation, but it's almost like it's starting to, and we spoke about this with the Vish, of the research that's kind of being done is looking and trying to answer questions for coaches rather than just trying to describe what the thing is happening or the observation of the task itself. And that's the thing that seems to be changing the most. So I do think the quality of the research is, as you mentioned, is changing and it's getting better.
Yeah.
The reason the coaches, and as Avish mentioned, the reason that coaches don't necessarily always follow what's going on is because they're usually a few steps ahead, right? And I don't mean that in a condescending way. Is usually what coaches want is someone to explain why they observe what they observe and what they're experiencing, rather than the other way around and be told, oh, you should do this.
Yeah.
It's more of I keep seeing this, it seems to work. Can you actually explain to me why? Because I don't really understand the mechanism behind it.
Yeah.
It's I tell someone to do this and they run faster. I think it's because of this, but we don't really know. And some of it might be, as we've spoken about, methodology of training and how you structure up things. And, you know, like I talk about, you know, the 10-200 session, like I spoke about it with Justin Rinaldi of like the Clyde Hart program. You know, he had guys, and he has had guys and girls run, you know, medal winning performances, running really, really fast over particularly 200 and 400, but doing 15 200s at 35 seconds kind of stuff. It's not, you can't do that stuff, and it's not valuable. It's just like, if you asked him why he does it, he probably has a specific answer. But if you actually looked at the underlying mechanism from a physiology research point of view, it's probably a different reason. Now, in his mind, I'm sure he's convinced that it works, and he'll keep doing it. I think he's retired now, but like he did it through a really long part of his career. What coaches I think are really, really good at, and we've spoken about this a lot, is understanding how to apply something to the person in front of them and continually adapting that based on, you know, Tom mentioned this before, of like how that changes over time.
Yeah, you got to adapt with the athlete. Like you can't think, we'll do this. We got a 1 meter improvement. I'll wait around and I'll do this again and get another 1 meter. Like that linear approach, like you'd love it to work, and like it sits in that neat little, like everything's pretty straight line A to B, but it's never ever the case.
I know we finish up there.
All right, thank you very much for joining us.